Have you ever read the works of Yoon-Ha Lee? If you have, well, you don't need me to tell you why the man is an absolute genius. But maybe stick around anyway. Join my Patreon. Buy my book.
Do it all right now.
Anyway, in case you're a fantasy and sci-fi fan who hasn't read Yoon-Ha Lee, well, the man's a genius. Watch me prove it. This is Fox Gambit, the first in a trilogy of space operas. And I'm fairly confident that all I need to do right now is give you a quick blurb about this book, and you'll see what I mean. Fox Gambit is set in a very, very far future, at a time where the laws of physics and the rules of mathematics are so well understood that time and space themselves can actually be manipulated just by a collective understanding of how they work. There is an intergalactic civilization called the Hexacut, and this Hexacut functions on a universally understood and agreed upon idea of how time and space operates. As long as every single person within the Hexacut agrees on how physics works, how time works, that's how it works. But fairly often, small heretic groups rise up to challenge this status quo. They all come together to agree upon a different understanding of universality. And because of how time and space operates, or rather I guess can be operated in the universe of this book, a group of people having a different idea of how time and space works actually threatens the very fabric of time and space. For example, let's say the Hexacut agrees that there are 24 hours in a day, and a small group of heretics say, no, there are 18 hours in a day. Well, now there might be. And a differing of opinion from the Hexacut is something that the Hexacut cannot stand for. But given the fact that the laws of physics themselves are actually at stake, it's almost understandable. This isn't just a difference of opinion when it comes to political ideologies. It's literally the fabric of the universe. Our protagonist is a woman named Cheris, who is a mathematical genius, but also a military captain. In the first chapter of the novel, she's doing a space battle, and tactics are everything in this book. Fox Gambit is as much a political and tactics-focused military space opera as it is a work of borderline surrealist mathematical insanity. In fact, on the back of my copy, legendary hard sci-fi author Stephen Baxter likens it to Starship Troopers. And I can see that. It has a military focus and it's very much about political allegory. But the genius of the book lies in its execution of mathematical concepts. I saw one reviewer on Goodreads say that in order to try and get your head around the laws and rules of this book, it helps to imagine that it's actually all set in a computer simulation. Trying to imagine the idea that agreed upon understanding of the universe changes how the universe operates, that's dizzying stuff. It's stuff that my brain kind of pushed back against and went, well, no, I can't do it. If you imagine that it's set in a simulation where the rules don't seem as fixed, kind of like the Matrix, it allows your brain to kind of accept the ideas presented to it. I thought that was a great tip. As I said, Cheris goes against the tactics presented to her and her team. She decides to do the battle differently, and she's punished for it as a result. But there's a new group of heretics who have risen up and taken control of a big space station made of needles, which you can see here on the cover. Occasionally throughout the novel, you read letters between members of this heretic group, and Cheris is put in command of an assault on this space station in order to quell or wipe out or subdue the heretics. But in order to do this, she's gonna need help. And why wouldn't that help be a ghost? Before she sets out, the Hexacut command put into Cheris's brain the consciousness of a dead madman. 1,000 years ago, this guy was a tactical military genius. A great soldier, a great tactician, but he also went insane and wiped out a lot of people on their side. Occasionally, his consciousness is thawed out and put into the brain of whoever is leading some kind of assault, and this time that person is Cheris. At first, the novel is very, very, very heavy. You will spend the first 50 pages not really understanding what's going on and just trying to wrap your head around this idea of time and space and physics and blah, blah, blah. My cat is causing mischief around me. If you spot anything in the background, let me know. So at the beginning, the book can seem kind of dry because it's so baffling and so heavy on the setup, and the setup asks a lot of the reader. But once Jadao's consciousness is put into Cheris's head, there's a lot more dialogue, and these characters can kind of come to life a little bit. So much of the book from this point on is a series of conversations between the two of them inside Cheris's head. Jadao will tell Cheris how to do the tactics, and Cheris will learn about Jadao as the story goes on. Was he really mad? Why did he do what he did, committing all of these terrible war crimes, blah blah blah? What's the truth of all this? And of course he will get to know her as well. Now while these characters are cis, there are quite a few light trans allegories in the science and the behaviour of these character elements, because Yoon-ha Lee himself is a trans man. And I really appreciated the kind of scientific gender exploration that's going on here, although I will admit it's very light. What's really remarkable, what makes Yoon-ha Lee a genius, is the fact that he had the gall, the audacity to present to us this kind of a world, this kind of a heavy political allegorical tale within this kind of mad world, and he made it all work. It's not an easy book to read. You have to focus on every single word, and I have ADHD. I'm a big sci-fi fan, and this thing exhausted me. I swear, I closed this book and I was panting. I was exhausted, but it's worth it. Which brings us to Phoenix Extravagant, a fantasy novel that is a very, very thinly veiled allegory, I guess is the word I need to use here, for the Japanese occupation of the Korean peninsula in the early 20th century leading up into World War II. The book is set in an entirely fantasy world, but that fantasy world is Korea, and the occupying empire in this world is Japan. I guess you can ignore that element if you don't know that much about this period of history, but why would you? I guess it feels like Lee is giving us that option because it's a fantasy story. Anyway, I initially picked up this book because in the blurb it describes a protagonist who's a painter. Rather than a soldier or a king or a prince or whatever else, Gyen Jebi is a painter. And that is a different approach for fantasy fiction. They are also non-binary, or at least genderless. They are referred to throughout the novel using only they, them pronouns, which is immediately really, really cool. I was very excited to pick up a standalone 300-page fantasy novel about a painter. Not your usual kind of protagonist. It's very rare in fantasy for a book to be standalone, and for it to be only 300 to 400 pages. Like, that is unheard of. Fantasy cannot contain itself. It's so hard to just have one clear, good story in fantasy about someone who isn't a prince or a knight or whatever. So our protagonist, Jebi, is Hwagugin, and the land of Hwaguk has been occupied by the Empire of Razan for several years now. When the novel begins, Jebi is taking an art exam, and they're fairly sure they're gonna get a job out of this. They're confident that they'll pass the exam and they'll be handed a job. And their sister, who has been very, very quietly part of an underground revolutionary movement for a while now, doesn't approve of how Jebi avoids being too political and is happy to toe the line drawn by the Razanay Empire. But Jebi doesn't pass the exam. They don't get a job. However, very, very shortly after, they are scooped up by some mysterious person, taken to a cave, and given a unique professional opportunity. See, the Razan Empire has these automatons, these robot-like machines that are given a kind of life and animation through magic paint that is created using different pigments, can be used by painters to create certain glyphs, and those glyphs are attached to the automatons and that brings them to life. The Empire of Razan was given so much knowledge and so many materials by the people of the West, and they use that knowledge and they use those tools to invade and occupy Hwaguk. And their big weapon can be seen on the cover, an enormous automaton dragon. But the dragon is faulty. It's not working properly. Something went really, really wrong when it was being tested. And Jebi is offered the job as a painter of fixing the dragon, painting the right kinds of glyphs, using the right kinds of pigments in order to make it subservient and functional as a weapon. They take the job because It doesn't seem like they have a choice, and from here on, they are going to learn and discover so much, and they will then be responsible for so much given their situation, given their skill set, given the knowledge that they stumble upon as they poke around and get talking to the dragon. I won't tell you any more. This is such a ride. It is so much fun. And these books differ beautifully. This is very, very intense science fiction. It is borderline surreal, inspired by the author's knowledge of maths and engineering. It is dizzying and confusing, but very, very exciting and strange, and you feel like anything is possible as a result. And this is far more a character-focused, allegorical work of almost historical fantasy. When you read them back to back, as I did, the big thing that stands out as a difference between them is how they read. While both of them have really great characters, this definitely has a focus on the setting and the concepts that it's exploring, while this is very much a character-led adventure through revolutions and political allegory that keeps the protagonist front and center. It feels like this novel is being pushed forward by Jebi, while in this one, Cheris carries us through a very, very densely populated and convoluted world. They're different. They're both genius works of science fiction and fantasy. I am genuinely staggered by the genius of Yoon Ha Lee. He is a writer like no other. He seems to see the boundaries established by the fantasy and sci-fi genres, and instead of pushing against those boundaries, he just ignores them entirely, almost as if he doesn't know that they exist. If you don't know they exist, you have nothing to hold your crazy ideas back, nothing to box you in as an artist, as a writer, as a fucking genius. There are no boundaries to Yoon Ha Lee, and so he does whatever he wants. And what he does is create incredible works of science fiction and fantasy. He ensures that his own Korean heritage and his own identity as a trans man are felt within these stories, and he creates wonderful, wonderful characters, but most of all, politically and conceptually fascinating worlds and settings. I cannot imagine another mind like his. If you're a fan of science fiction and fantasy, you must read the works of Yoon Ha Lee. And I also recommend you support me on Patreon if you've enjoyed this video. That's also a very, very smart move. Subscribe for books.